The fall of Samuel. The rain pounded against the windshield as Samuel drove aimlessly. His hands trembled on the steering wheel, and his eyes, red from crying, could barely make out the blurred city lights. His life had crumbled in a matter of weeks. His wife had left him. His children, victims of a terrible accident, lay in a coma at the hospital. His business, the dream he had built through years of hard work, had collapsed under a mountain of debt. But the worst part was the emptiness inside him. The faith that had once sustained him was now gone. He clenched his teeth, feeling a burning rage in his chest. If God exists, why does he allow this? He thought bitterly. He had no answers, only an unbearable pain that suffocated him. A car horn jolted him from his thoughts. Without realizing it, he had drifted into the wrong lane. He corrected his course and took a deep breath. He couldn't keep going like this. It made no sense. He decided to stop at the first place he found. That was when he saw a small church at the end of the street, illuminated by a warm light in the midst of the storm. He didn't know why, but something inside him urged him to go in. With his heart pounding, he parked the car and stepped out. His feet felt as heavy as the weight of his tragedy, yet he crossed the threshold. Inside, an elderly pastor awaited him with a serene smile. "Welcome, son. We've been expecting you." A shiver ran down Samuel's spine. "Expecting me?" he thought, confused. He didn't recall speaking to anyone, much less planning to enter a church. The elderly pastor, with a peaceful gaze and a deep voice, approached him calmly. "You look tired, son." His tone was not accusatory but filled with compassion. "Here you can rest." Samuel swallowed hard. His first instinct was to step back, but his legs wouldn't respond. A strange peace, foreign to his turmoil, enveloped him. He stammered, unsure of what to say. The pastor didn't press him. He simply pointed to one of the wooden pews and gestured for him to sit. Too exhausted to resist, Samuel obeyed. He rested his elbows on his knees and buried his face in his hands. "God brought you here for a reason," the old man said after a moment of silence. "Sometimes, when everything seems lost, he is closer than ever." Samuel let out a bitter laugh. "If God were close, my life wouldn't be a disaster." The pastor remained unfazed. "Do you really believe he abandoned you?" he asked gently. "Or have you stopped looking for him?" The words hit Samuel harder than he expected. He had no answer. His faith, the very thing that had once given him purpose, now felt like a distant echo of a life that no longer existed. The silence stretched on. Outside, the rain continued to fall, tapping against the windows. Finally, the pastor sat beside him and spoke with calm certainty. "You don't have to have all the answers tonight, son. You just have to allow yourself to listen." For the first time in a long while, Samuel felt a small spark of something he had nearly forgotten: hope. Samuel stared at the pastor, feeling those words pierce deep into his soul. He wanted to respond, to argue, but he was too tired. It was as if every battle he had fought had left him empty, drained of the strength to go on. "Listen to what?" he finally asked, his voice barely a whisper. The old man smiled warmly. "God's whisper in the midst of your storm." Samuel sighed. He ran a hand over his face, his eyes burning from lack of sleep. "What if I don't want to listen anymore?" he murmured. "What if everything I've been through is proof that there's nothing beyond suffering?" The pastor interlaced his fingers and looked at Samuel without judgment. "Son, there's something you must understand. Faith isn't about never falling, it's about rising after the fall. You are not the only one who has walked through the fire, but that doesn't mean you have to remain in the ashes." The words made Samuel avert his gaze. A part of him wanted to believe them, but another part resisted with all its might. The old man remained silent for a moment before continuing. Many years ago, I also thought everything was lost. I lost my wife and my son in an accident. For a long time, I carried resentment in my heart, questioning why God had taken away what I loved most. But one day, I realized something. He had never abandoned me. Samuel looked at him, surprised. "How can you say that after what you went through?" The pastor smiled with quiet sorrow. "Because in my worst moment, when I thought I had no strength left, He sent people who helped me stand again. Sometimes, God doesn't take away the storm, but He gives us shelter in the midst of it." A lump formed in Samuel's throat. The pastor's story reflected his own pain in a way he had never imagined. "Maybe," he whispered, not daring to finish the thought. The pastor placed a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to figure everything out tonight, son. Just let God show you the way." Samuel closed his eyes. For the first time in a long while, he allowed a small flame of hope to flicker within his heart. Samuel remained silent. He didn't know what to say or how to feel. The pastor's words had touched him, but his heart was still wounded, trapped in a whirlwind of doubt and despair. The old man stood calmly and walked to a small altar at the back of the church. He lit a candle and looked at Samuel with patient eyes. "Sometimes, all we need is to take a small step," he said gently. "You don't have to have all the answers now. You just need the courage to try." Samuel swallowed hard. His mind was torn between disbelief and the desperate need to hold on to something. Anything that would give him a reason to keep going. "I don't know how to do it," he finally confessed, his voice heavy with anguish. "I don't know how to pray, how to believe again." The pastor nodded with understanding. "You don't need perfect words. Just talk to God as you would with a friend. Tell Him how you feel, even if it's anger or pain. He doesn't reject you for your sadness, son. He listens to you, even in your silence." Samuel lowered his gaze. He had never thought of prayer that way. He always believed it was an act of pure faith, something one only did when certain of what they believed. But in that moment, all he had was his suffering. The pastor sat beside him again and, after a few seconds of silence, began to pray softly. "Lord, here is your son, Samuel. He comes not with certainties, but with a broken heart. But we know that you heal what is shattered, that you give hope to those who have lost it. Show him, Father, that he is not alone." Samuel felt something break inside him. It wasn't just the pastor's words, but the feeling that, for the first time in a long while, someone understood him. His eyes began to fill with tears. He didn't know if he could believe again, but in that instant, he felt a deep longing to try. "God," he whispered almost without realizing, "if you're there, show me that there's still hope for me." The words came out clumsy, uncertain, but inside he felt something different. It wasn't an immediate response or a visible miracle, just a small peace, as if, for a moment, his burden was a little lighter. The pastor smiled tenderly. "That is the first step, son. And God always answers, though sometimes in ways we don't expect." Samuel nodded, wiping his tears with the back of his hand. Maybe he didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in a long while, he felt that he wasn't completely lost. That night, Samuel stayed in the church longer than he had planned. He didn't say much, but he didn't feel pressured to either. The pastor allowed the silence, respecting the weight of his pain. Finally, when the rain let up, Samuel stood. "Thank you for listening to me," he said, unsure of what else to say. The elderly pastor nodded with a knowing smile. "The doors of this church will always be open for you, son. And remember this. God doesn't need you to have all the answers, only that you allow Him into your heart." Samuel gave a slight nod and left the church. The cool night air hit his face, and for the first time in days, he felt like he could breathe a little easier. He drove home, to a house that now felt empty, without the echo of his children's laughter or the warmth of his wife. He collapsed onto the couch and closed his eyes. The pain was still there. Nothing had truly changed, but there was one small difference. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself the possibility of hope. The following days were difficult. Samuel visited the church at night, though he often didn't speak. He just sat in silence, letting his wounded soul find a moment of rest. The pastor never pressured him, simply offering his company and, from time to time, sharing small stories of faith and overcoming struggles. But life kept demanding his attention. One morning, he received a call from the hospital. His younger son's condition had worsened. Samuel felt his heart sink. He drove to the hospital in a rush, his hands trembling. When he arrived, the doctors explained that the boy had suffered a relapse and that the situation was critical. He sat by his son's bedside, watching him in silence. "I'm sorry," he whispered, holding the child's small hand. "I don't know what to do. I don't know how to help you." Tears streamed down his face. He felt powerless, defeated. In that moment, he remembered the pastor's words, "God always answers, though sometimes in ways we don't expect." Samuel closed his eyes tightly. "God, if you're really there, if you can really hear me, help me. Not for me, but for him." The room remained silent. There was no instant miracle, no voice from heaven. But Samuel felt something inside him, a soft certainty, like a whisper in his soul telling him that he was not alone. And for the first time in a long time, he chose to believe it. Samuel stayed awake all night beside his son. His breathing was weak, and the monitors beeped steadily, a constant reminder of how fragile life was. Dawn came slowly, painting the room in a faint golden hue. Samuel had not closed his eyes for even a second. He held his son's small hand tightly, as if just touching him could anchor him to life. In the stillness of the hospital, a thought crossed his mind. What if this is God's answer? He didn't want to think about it. He didn't want to imagine the possibility of losing his son. But another part of him, the part that had begun to open up to faith again, clung to hope. Suddenly, the door to the room opened. It was the pastor. "I heard what happened," he said softly, sitting down next to Samuel. "How is the boy?" Samuel shook his head. "The doctors say he's in God's hands." The old man nodded. "Then let's pray." Samuel lowered his gaze. "I already did. But what if God doesn't hear me? What if my son?" He couldn't finish the sentence. The pastor placed a hand on his shoulder. "God always listens, but his answer isn't always what we expect." Samuel felt a pang in his chest. "Are you telling me that I might have to accept that my son won't wake up?" The pastor looked at him tenderly. "I'm telling you that no matter what happens, God won't leave you alone, and he won't leave your son alone either." Samuel pressed his lips together. He wanted to argue, to shout that he couldn't accept that, but he was too tired to fight. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. "All right," he finally whispered. "Let's pray." The pastor took his hand, and together they bowed their heads. "Lord, at this moment, we place this child's life in your hands. We know that you have the power to heal, to restore, to do the impossible. But beyond our will, let yours be done." Samuel felt his heart tremble. "And if your plan is different from what we want," the pastor continued, "give us the strength to accept it and the peace to keep trusting in you." Samuel squeezed his eyes shut. "God," he whispered, "let your will be done. But if it's possible, save him." The room fell silent, and then a faint movement in his son's hand made Samuel open his eyes in shock. He held his breath. He looked at the monitor and saw something that left him speechless. His son's heart rate was strengthening. Samuel spent the night at the hospital, never leaving his son's bedside. He barely slept, only watching the slow rise and fall of his chest, fearing that at any moment it might stop. From time to time, he looked up at the ceiling, as if waiting for an answer, a sign that his prayer had been heard. He couldn't deny that something inside him felt different since he had allowed himself to pray again, but doubt still lingered, fighting to hold on. In the morning, the doctor entered with a serious expression. "We've stabilized your son, but he's still in critical condition. The best thing you can do is be here for him." Samuel nodded, feeling a weight lift slightly from his chest. It wasn't the definitive answer he was hoping for, but there was still hope. Later, as he walked through the hospital hallways to clear his mind, he ran into the pastor. "I heard what happened," the old man said in a calm tone. "How are you?" Samuel shrugged. "I don't know. I'm not okay, but I'm not as lost as before." The pastor smiled. "That's progress, son. Sometimes faith isn't about feeling good right away, but about learning to trust even in uncertainty." Samuel sighed. "Last night I prayed, but I don't know if God heard me." The old man placed a hand on his shoulder. "God always listens, Samuel. Sometimes his answer doesn't come at the moment or in the way we expect, but his presence is there, even in the midst of pain." Samuel remained silent. He wanted to believe it. He wanted to hold on to that idea with all his strength. The pastor took a small book from his pocket and handed it to him. "Read this when you can. It's Psalm 46. Samuel took the book with trembling hands. He couldn't remember the last time he had opened a Bible, but something inside him told him to do it. That night, back in his son's hospital room, he opened the book and read softly, "God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth be removed, and though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea." The words sank deep into his heart. He didn't fully understand them, but in that moment, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. He allowed himself to close his eyes and, for the first time in years, he slept with the feeling that he wasn't completely alone. Samuel woke up with a strange sense of tranquility. He couldn't remember the last time he had slept without being startled awake, without anxiety wrenching him from sleep in the middle of the night. He sat up and looked at his son, who was still unconscious, but his breathing was steady. He took a deep breath. "God is our refuge and strength." He repeated in his mind the words from the psalm he had read the night before. He couldn't explain it, but those words had begun to plant something inside him. A doctor entered the room, checked the machines and the child's vital signs, then looked at Samuel with a slight smile. "There's a slight improvement," he reported. "We can't say he's out of danger, but his body is responding well." Samuel felt his heart pound. It was just a small step, but after so many days of anguish, any sign of hope meant everything to him. When the doctor left, Samuel approached his son's bed and gently took his hand. "Hold on, champ," he whispered. "Dad's here." A few hours later, he received another call, this time from the bank. "Sir, we need to talk to you about your debt." Samuel closed his eyes in frustration. His business had collapsed, and with it, his financial stability. He knew he would have to face it eventually, but right now, his priority was his son. He hung up the call without answering. Then, with a heavy sigh, he pulled out the small book the pastor had given him. He read Psalm 46 again. "Therefore we will not fear, though the earth be removed." He stared at the open page, feeling as if those words were a challenge to him. "God, if you're really here, if you're really with me, help me not to be afraid." His voice trembled, but inside, He felt a certainty that surprised him. Maybe his life was still a mess, but now he didn't feel completely alone. He didn't know how, but for the first time in a long time, he believed that everything could change. The days passed slowly at the hospital. Samuel remained by his son's side, watching every small sign of improvement. There were no instant miracles, but the simple fact that his son kept fighting gave him the strength to keep going. One afternoon, the pastor visited him again, carrying a small bag of food. "You can't take care of your son if you don't take care of yourself," he said with a smile, handing him a wrapped sandwich. Samuel accepted it with gratitude. "Thank you, Pastor." The old man took a seat beside him and observed him in silence for a moment. "I have seen a change in you, Samuel." Samuel lowered his gaze, feeling a lump in his throat. "I don't know if anything has really changed," he whispered. "I'm still afraid. I still don't have answers." The pastor smiled warmly. "Fear doesn't mean you lack faith. Sometimes, faith is about continuing to walk even when fear is present." Samuel slowly nodded. "I've been reading Psalm 46, he admitted. "I don't know why, but it brings me peace." "Because it is the truth," the old man replied. "God is our refuge, even when everything else seems to be falling apart." Samuel sighed and ran a hand over his face. "I still don't know how to fix my life. My business is ruined, my debts are still there, and my son is still in a coma." The pastor looked at him with serenity. God didn't promise that everything would change overnight, but he did promise that you wouldn't be alone in the battle. At that moment, his son's heart monitor made a different sound. Samuel immediately stood up, his heart pounding. A nurse rushed in and checked the child's vital signs. Samuel held his breath, expecting the worst, but the nurse smiled. "He's responding. His level of consciousness is improving." Samuel felt tears streaming down his face. He stepped closer and gently held his son's hand. "Champ," he whispered. "I'm here." The pastor placed a hand on his shoulder and spoke softly. "God is working, Samuel. Just keep trusting." Samuel squeezed his son's hand and closed his eyes. For the first time in a long time, hope wasn't just a wish, it was a reality. The next day brought an unexpected turn. The child, still weak, slowly woke up. Samuel was by his side, holding his hand tightly, when he saw his eyes open. "Dad!" His son's voice was barely a whisper, but at that moment, it sounded like the most beautiful melody to Samuel. "Son," he said, unable to hold back his tears. "You're awake." The boy looked around, confused, but smiled when he saw his father. "What happened?" he asked, still groggy. Samuel smiled, unable to stop crying. "You've been recovering. Thank God. You're getting better." The doctor arrived shortly after to perform the necessary checkups. After running some tests, he confirmed that the improvement was significant. Though there was still a long road ahead, the progress was evident. At last, Samuel exhaled in relief. Not everything had been resolved, but his son's life was no longer in danger. As the doctor left, the pastor entered the room. "Thank God," the old man said, smiling. "I've been praying for him and for you." Samuel nodded, feeling a mix of gratitude and awe. "I don't know what I would have done without your support. My faith was almost broken. But now I believe that God did hear my prayers." The pastor approached and placed a hand on his shoulder. "It wasn't just your faith, Samuel. It was God's will working in your life, even when you couldn't see it. And now he is calling you to a new path." Samuel felt the weight of those words. He still had to deal with his debts, the uncertainty of the future, and his own healing process, but something inside him had changed. Restoration was not only physical but also spiritual. Throughout the week, his son's health continued to improve. Each day he felt more hopeful. He realized that there were things he could no longer control, but something inside him had shifted. Fear was still there, but it no longer had the final word. He sat in the small chair beside his son's bed, looking at the open window as if the sunlight was speaking to him in silence. "Thank you, God, for not leaving me alone." The sun shone gently through the hospital window, illuminating the room where Samuel and his son rested. Though the scars of the past remained, Samuel no longer felt so lost. He knew that restoration didn't happen overnight, but he also understood that his faith, though fragile, had been the anchor in the middle of the storm. One afternoon, after another visit from the doctor confirming his son's recovery, Samuel stepped out of the hospital with the feeling that his life was taking a turn he could never have imagined. There was still much to do. His debts remained, his business was still in ruins, and the pain of losing his wife still weighed on his heart. But he was no longer alone. The faith he had abandoned for so long was now beginning to heal the cracks in his soul. The pastor called out to him as he walked through the hospital parking lot. "How are you, Samuel?" "I'm better, thank God," he replied with a timid smile. "My son is out of danger." The pastor smiled warmly. "God has shown you his mercy, and now that you have taken this first step, he will guide you on the path of restoration, even if it's not always easy." Samuel nodded. "I know there's a lot to heal, not just in my life, but also in my heart. But for the first time in a long time, I feel like I can start again." The old man placed a hand on his shoulder, his eyes filled with hope. "That's the first step, Samuel. Each day is a new opportunity. You are not alone." Samuel looked up at the sky, remembering the words of the psalm that had accompanied him in those days. "Be still and know that I am God." At last he understood. He didn't need to have all the answers or control everything around him. He just needed to trust. When he returned home, Samuel sat in the old armchair he once shared with his wife. Though everything seemed different, his heart knew that the journey was just beginning. He was not alone in his pain or in his struggles, and though the future remained uncertain, he had the certainty that restoration was possible. He bowed his head in prayer, feeling the peace of someone who had found something greater than his fears. "Thank you, God. Thank you for not giving up on me." From that day on, Samuel would not only fight for his son, but also for his own restoration. And though the road ahead would be long and full of challenges, something had changed in his heart. Faith in God, faith in his family, and faith in his own ability to start anew.